Hello, welcome to my shop. I'm Kevin May. I want to tell you a little bit about myself. I'm married to my beautiful wife Patricia, who's a realtor here in Cobb County, and I have a 30-year-old son named Eric. I also want to tell you a little bit about my background professionally. When I was 20 years old, I started as a draftsman in a machine shop, and I worked my way up into machine design and been designing packaging machinery for the beverage industry for practically 40 years now, and now I lead the group. When my son graduated from high school, that's when I started woodworking. That was about 11 years ago. I was definitely a beginner, a novice, and one of the things I worked into was making cutting board. As well as most of you know, getting into woodworking, I started spending a lot of money on woodworking tools. To compensate for all of the money I was spending on the tools, I decided I'd start trying to sell some cutting board. Worked myself up and started making a lot of cutting boards and selling those cutting boards at craft shows. As a result of selling cutting boards, I've become very familiar with prepping wood, gluing strips together, planing wood, using the beautiful colors of the various hardwoods, exotics, and domestic woods, and making some very interesting patterns. Not too elaborate, but I do make a lot of in-grain cutting boards, edge grain cutting boards, what I call cheese boards because they have the cheese slicing wire, lazy Susans, and various other little boards like that. Many of the tricks I've learned through this experience is related more towards trying to save time and effort and economize the use of lumber. Next, we'll get into the process of making a cutting board. I have been through 40 years in a corporate engineering environment, and safety has been drilled into me, and I want to drill it into you. Woodworkers, you're creating, you're making, you have a good level of intelligence. So I'm not going to teach you anything about safety today. I'm going to remind you about safety. Things to think about with cutting boards is cutting, table saw, handheld circular saws, chop saws. Stay away from the sharp parts. Kickback, I have been hit a few times by kickback on the table saw. Please be careful. The joiner can rip your fingers apart. The joiner is just as dangerous, if not more so, than the table. Planers can be dangerous. One of the worst things with them can be kickback. Your router, it's a high-speed cutting bit, exposed. Stay away from it. One that many woodworkers don't consider is the wood dust. You have to protect yourself from the wood. In my shop, I have a big vacuum system. I have a dust collection system. I have a face mask. Another one, lifting. Behind me on the table is a plank. Between the plank and the clamps, it's in excess of 100 pounds. You need to be considerate of that. And of course, hearing. Wear your hearing protection. I hadn't taught you a thing. I just want to remind you about safety. Now, what is a cutting board? In my terms, a cutting board is simply a flat surface for cutting or carrying that is portable, durable, and washable. We did say cutting. That means that the material needs to be soft to your knife and able to not dull the knife when it's in use. Wikipedia says a cutting board or chopping board is a durable board on which to place material for cutting. The kitchen cutting board is commonly used in preparing food. Other types exist for cutting raw materials such as leather or plastic. Kitchen cutting boards are often made of wood or plastic and come in various sizes and widths. There's cutting boards, there's charcuterie boards, butcher blocks, cheese boards, butter boards, serving boards, bread boards, carving boards, butcher boards, chopping boards. You put any name on it you want. You're going to use it as you desire. Some are more adept at one purpose than another. The photos you're seeing are the various types and uses of what I generally, and we're going to call today, cutting boards. I'm going to talk about the basic cutting boards today, both edge grain and end grain. I'll break it down, and I've named them either solid boards or pattern boards. A solid board can be a single piece of wood. It can be rectangular. It can be a live edge board. It can be a board that you're using for the colorful grains or burls in the wood. And you can cut shapes. I've seen often a pig shape for cutting pork on, or one with a long handle that all can be made out of a solid piece of wood. Today's focus is on pattern boards. There's really two different types. There's the edge grain, which are also called long grain, face grain, or flat grain. There's also end grain. End grain boards have a great characteristics because the construction of the board has the grains of the wood pointing up towards the surface of the board. These grains pointing in that orientation provide the best wear characteristic and are the easiest on your knives. They do not dull your knife. The old classic butcher block was made out of hard maple. It was made for utilitarian uses as a long-term durable board on which meats were cut. I grew up in a grocery store. I remember having that butcher block and how many years it lasted, and you were able to see where the butcher would stand because that part of the board through many years of use would actually wear down from them cutting meats and then cleaning the board by scraping. Then the more elaborate boards that most of us are going to make are pattern boards. There can be simple patterns using repeating or similar patterns like a checkerboard, boards that I call interlaced. There's chevron patterns. There's numerous patterns. There's also complex patterning requiring piece by piece gluing. I'm not going to cover that process. Those are more elaborate. You can find a lot of information on the net about those types of boards. Now, one of the things specific to end grain cutting boards that I have been giving as a recommendation for a long time is how thick to make an end grain cutting board. If you make an end grain cutting board and you make it very thin, the board can split along the grains of the wood. My personal experience, it will never split on the glue line. If you apply Titebond 3 glue, you compress it correctly, you have the surfaces so they're flat. I've yet had one of my boards break on the glue line. So you need to make sure that the thickness of the board is adequate for the size of the board. My recommendation is if you take the average of the width and the length of the board. If you have a board 12 inches wide, 18 inches long, the average is 15 inches. If you take 10% of that is 1.5 inches. So for a 12 inch by 18 inch board, the minimum thickness I recommend is 1.5 inches. When you're prepping your material, always think that you're going to be cutting and trimming material. You're going to be cutting sections out. You're going to be removing that with the width of your table saw blade. You're going to sand surfaces flat, especially when you're making the end grain cutting board. Sometimes you run into blemishes in the wood and you decide you don't want to use one of the segments you've created. So my recommendation is always to plan to have extra wood to take care of those issues. And then what I commonly do is I can use those segments to make smaller boards as well if it all turns out okay. Cutting board embellishments. Things like juice grooves, feet, handles, which can be handles that are bolted onto the board. I call normally a board that has a metal handle applied as a serving board. You can cut handles through the board. In end grain cutting boards that are thicker, you can cut grooves into the ends of the boards that serve as handles. You can put finger holes in. Finger holes are not only a handle to pick it up with, but are often used to hang a board up in a kitchen, on the wall, or from a utensil rack. Many boards that I call cheese boards, we have the cutting wire installed to allow you to cut the cheese with a thin wire. Some elaborate situations, people put knife or other utensils storage grooves in the bottom or edge of a cutting board. You can have cutting boards laser engraved or CNC engraved. For the most part, I'm not going to go into any detail on any of these embellishments, but obviously they can be used to enhance any of your boards if you so desire. Size and shape of a cutting board. In my little world, edge grain cutting boards are made out of 4x4 material that I normally buy, and it comes to me at about 13/16 thick. Through the process of gluing and then planing that down into flat surfaces, those edge grain cutting boards normally end up at 3/4 of an inch or slightly under. Edge grain cutting boards are great in that the strength versus weight ratio is very high. You can make a very large edge grain cutting board being only 3/4 of an inch thick, and it's durable and useful. End grain cutting boards, because of that minimum thickness requirement that I talked about to prevent them from breaking, they become a bit heavier because of the thickness. You're going to create an 18 by 24 inch end grain cutting board. It's going to be about 2 1/8 inch or thicker. That's going to start being heavy. Many people don't necessarily want that. Some people do want the big, beefy end grain cutting board. Just know what you're getting into before you start. Another thing to consider about the size of the cutting board is you need to have the tool set to make your cutting boards. Joiner width is somewhat a limiting factor, but the real limiting factor is to use your planer, create a flat plank. Some of the DeWalt, Ryobi, Makita planers are 13 or 13.5 inch width maximum, which makes a very nice size cutting board. I'm fortunate I've got a large 20 inch planer so I can make larger boards. But you really need to think about your tools, your equipment, your shop when you're planning on what size boards you're going to make. As mentioned once before in my introduction, one of the things about these cutting boards is we get to use the beauty of the wood. So I'm going to talk about the characteristics we consider when choosing woods. Availability is for sure one of the important things. What woods are available to us in our local area? The hardness or the Janka rating. Softwoods are not great for cutting boards. Low porosity. You need closed pores for the best quality cutting board. Open pores will retain juices from the materials you're cutting, so you want a low porosity board. Toxicity of the board. Not so much for the finished product, but you have to be considerate of the toxicity of the board when you're building the board. The chips and dust from woods can be toxic. One of the most common, walnut, is irritant to many people. The durability, somewhat closely related to the hardness. And then, finally, the cost of the wood. Some of the woods I use are $20 a board foot. Most of the woods I use are just south of $10 a board foot. The best wood, my humble opinion, is hard maple. Black walnut is another great wood. Why? The hardness is adequate at 1010 and it provides a beautiful brown color. Cherry, another great wood because of the color, closed pores. Its hardness is 950, kind of on the little bit softer side, but I've used it for years and it works great. Purple heart, another good wood. It's a bit more expensive, it's very hard, but it is available, works great. Yellow heart, I've used it. For those of you who may know, I'm an LSU fan. Some of my original boards I patterned LSU using purple for the letters and yellow heart for the rest of the board. It was beautiful. Yellow heart's another great wood. The hardness is up, it works well. Availability is somewhat rare. I have been able to purchase it locally in the past years. Padauk is another great wood. It's used because of the color. It may not be the greatest wood because its pores are a little bit more open. Properly cleaned and maintained, it works fine. Hickory is nice, low cost. Zebra wood is expensive, but it can provide some beautiful patterns. Sapelli, mahogany, jatoba, soft maple are all other great woods. Now I'm going to talk on some that are the lower end. Red oak. This is debatable. Anybody that likes debating, I'm not one of those. I'll never build a board out of red oak. I've reworked some boards made out of red oak. The pores in wood, my personal opinion, if the pore will absorb, I'll just use the liquid from a steak, it will also absorb liquid detergent. If a board is cleaned properly, I wouldn't be afraid to use it. As I just said though, I'll never make a board out of oak because of the porosity of the wood. White oak kind of fits that same thing. Wingy is another one. It'll be in the board. One of the boards you see in the presentation today, it has Wingy. It's what, $20 a board foot. Expensive. It's also another beautiful dark colored wood. You can review the list. Pine. Lots of people I've seen on the net make cutting boards out of pine. Well, I'd never consider, I can't imagine an edge grain board out of pine would last more than a couple of weeks. An end grain board out of the proper pine, managed right, yeah, it'll work. It's not what I do. It's not what you would consider the best wood for a cutting board. Now, you've designed your board. You've determined what wood you want to use. Now you got to go purchase it. What types of wood to purchase? At the lumber stores, you can get rough wood, finished 4 sides or finished 2 sides. I normally am either using rough cut or finished on 2 sides. And that finish is a rough cut finish. Just know what you're getting, what you got to deal with. Think about tools you have at home to improve. Do you have the right joiner and planer to finish rough cut wood? Or do you need to make sure you get finished on 2 sides, because you can probably deal with that mostly on your table saw. You can also buy kits. If you're just beginning making your first cutting board and you want to go buy a kit, Rockler and Woodcraft both sell cutting board kits with the wood already stripped out for you and ready to glue. Next, we're going to start on wood prep. Wood prep is going to be driven largely by the tools you have available. I'm hoping that most of you have at least a box planer with that 13-inch capacity. It's going to make the creation of a cutting board from rough lumber much easier if you have that planer. A joiner is also a very large benefit. I'm going to assume everybody has a table saw. I'm going to assume everybody has a random orbital sander. So the next step is preparing your wood, thinking about what you need on length and width of your raw materials to fit into your tools. The other consideration is the length of the planks. I call them planks. When we take the wood, we prep it to size, and then we cut them into strips to start gluing and mixing the strips together to make the beautiful patterns. You need to prepare for that, and then you're going to glue it up into planks of a certain length. When you go and you're buying rough wood, you will see lengths of 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 feet long. You never know with the different type woods what length wood is going to be available. You have to plan for what length planks you want to glue up. If you're making an individual board, you may want to make a plank of 24 inches. If you're making a little bit larger board and want to plan for some spare, you go to 36 inches. Throughout the years, I've used a lot of 4-foot sections. 4-foot sections can start to become heavy, especially when you're gluing together thick planks and making end grain. All that needs to be thought of ahead of your process, as well as when you start inspecting your wood. When you buy rough cut lumber, you're going to have blemishes in the wood. You're going to have knot holes. You're going to have some splits. You may even find bug holes that you're going to want to cut around. You need to inspect and plan for all of those aspects of the wood before you start cutting. Think through it, mark it out before you start cutting. These are some pieces that I purchased to make some boards out of and to use in our presentation. Okay, so we have Jatoba, cherry, maple, sapelli, walnut, and hickory. These are woods that I use quite commonly. Others 3 that I use really a lot of: Padauk, Purple Heart, and Yellow Heart. I didn't have any of them in this group. Now we're talking about length. You can see the varied lengths that these pieces came in. I'm thinking this Jatoba, 7 foot. The cherry is 8. You know, here's another 8, and then all the way up to the sapelli, 12 foot. So you get every different thing from the lumber store, and you got to figure out how to best use that. You also have, okay, here's a knot in the maple. How to plan for that. You don't want to glue that up in the middle of your plank, because that's going to be a wasted piece or a bad spot in your board. On this end, the cherry's got a split in it. The Jatoba has a bad spot on the surface. It was probably caused by the forklift. A little knot here in the hickory that you may want to avoid. All of that needs to be planned for. You've got your plan, what you want to make, work it into the amount of wood you need, the lengths you need, and the different widths of strips that you want. I don't have a plan because that's one of the fabulous things when you're making quantity of cutting boards. I do plan for my length. I cut lots of strips and I have hundreds of strips laid out, and I pick from the strips that are available to create my patterns. If you're making an end-grain board, which we will see a plank for that in a little while, you have to plan for that from the beginning. But these boards are going to be going into planks for edge grain. We may make an end grain out of one of them. But you'll see that as we get into prepping the wood and turning it into, I guess it's F3S, finished on 3 sides, that we will then turn into our strips. Making end grain boards, the sap and the heartwood and the coloring, depending on the way you orient that in the end grain board, you can create some really pretty stuff with that color variation. And hickory makes excellent boards. It's a pain in the butt to work with. We've ended up with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 pieces 50-inch long. These all came off of the planer. They were roughly planed to 13/16 and 1 planed edge. The other side is rough. This is common that I get from Peach State lumber. We will not have to joint these boards because they're flat enough, planed from Peach State. I'm not going to have to joint these, which is good. Saves time. If they were rough cut, you'd have to joint the face, and then the edge square to that face, go to the planer, make the opposite side parallel to the other face. We'll show you bits and pieces of the wood prepping process, but it's 4 squaring wood. There's many videos on that whole process. I'm going to show you the specific aspects and how I go about it to make it a little easier on making the planks for these cutting boards. We're back inside now from cutting our lumber into our 50-inch segments. That's what we calculated were some lengths to get the most utilization out of the pieces of lumber that we had. This lumber has 2 sides finished and a 3rd side finished. I'm not enthused at the smoothness of the 3rd side because that is a side that we will be gluing, and I want that straight and smooth. So I'm going to go through many operations. I have the jointer and the table saw. I will straighten an edge and I will come and cut it to width, and then I will plane the opposite side that came off the saw, because even with this nice saw and nice blade, to make gluing work as consistently as you can, you want to smooth the surface as you can get. Many people will use a glue edge from the table saw. I prefer not to. If you have a plan made out for the board you're making and you know the width of the strips that you want, you need to be planning that now. As I have these 8 boards, I'm going to cut various widths. I'm going to cut some 2-inch, some 1.5 and 1-inch wide strips, because I know I've used those widths to make up small boards in different patterns that match very well. I'm not having to plan so much because I have a quantity of boards that I'm going to use. I'm going to make a quantity of planks out of these strips. Join an edge, rough cut a width, plane that width to have a smooth surface, and I'll have a stack of strips of the various species of woods in 1, 1.5, and 2 inches wide. When you're doing that, you're going to end up with some thin strips to drop. If they're not too thin, I may plane those to a random width that works into making various board patterns. So I'll get started. Four 9 1-inch boards, 6 1.5-inch boards, 7 2-inch boards. Take those to the planer real quick to skim. You know, we've got the bottom edge that came off the planer. The top edge is the saw cut edge. 2 faces are what we got from the lumber yard. Evaluated that to be okay. So when we skim cut these to size, then the next step will be to lay out our pattern and glue planks. I'll plane these to size real quick. Now, wood prep of this group of boards is complete. Not starting with a defined pattern for a board, I'll sit here and I'll make a pattern. I'll show you a little trick that I use for when I want to make a random ingrain pattern, which we will turn some of this into an ingrain, some of this into a edge grain board. Edge grain is simple as one glue up and you're basically through. The ingrain, you need to definitely make a little bit more planning. So what I'm going to do is grab some of these, do something like this. For an ingrain pattern, I keep laying out stuff symmetrical from center lines because I use that a lot in edge grains. But on ingrains, you're wanting to shift things around a bit. So the dimensions of the boards kind of need to vary so that the alignment of the joints in the woods from one end to the other. So if this were to work out, this board would end up being 9 inches wide, which is not a bad width for a board. I'll grab a piece of paper off the floor, and it's going to be what I'm going to use to check this layout. What I will do is I'm going to mark the joints between the boards. And then I'm going to reverse the paper and see how many of those joints from one when you're going to alternate these in an ingrain board. I got lucky because it doesn't look really good when those joints align from one to the next, but if they're all staggered off step, that makes a pretty ingrain pattern. So this group of boards will be our ingrain. So I'm not going to lose this layout. Now for just making some nice edge grain boards where the pattern you're going to see is the sides, the faces of the boards. So this is what we've got to work with. Symmetry of the grain, the types of woods is good, definitely not required. So I'm looking at the pieces that I have of the different species and where can I get some symmetry on similar sizes. And this is where you get into kind of, ooh, you didn't plan. No, I didn't. So you deal with what you've got on making a pattern. So there's a pattern. That would make some nice 8 by 12 inch edge grain cutting boards. Now we're going to start with gluing up panels. I've got 2 locations. I've got my clamping section here and my gluing I will show you over there. These are some custom calls that I've made. I'm glue up one set using these, and then one set using some angle iron that I've got that I use for years, that you could, instead of using angle iron, you can use some wood strips. So I'll get started in the process. The planks that we're gluing up are 4 foot long. Most people will tell me that I overdo the clamps. I'll have 8 clamps spread over the 48-inch boards. Your basic wax paper. I buy this in quite some quantity. I cover my cawls and my clamps with a piece of wax paper. I've got silicone mats that I cover my table saw and my floor with. So this is the pattern that we're gluing. The first thing to do is to figure out what orientation I want to go from here to my clamps, and I'm going to go like so. All right, this is the surface that will be contacting the first board in my clamps. So I want to apply glue to this side, and continuing throughout the process, I apply glue to one side of my boards. I do not apply glue to both sides. I apply plenty of glue to one side. I found that to be, when your boards are nice and flat, you've seen the process of how we flatten and square the boards, that works great. Favorite glue applicator, and when I'm gluing up narrow boards, I'll either use the silicone brush or the silicone roller to spread the glue on the edge of the boards. A simple bead with practice, maybe you kind of learn how much glue to apply. You can always wipe off excess glue. You can always add more glue if you need it. I made my cute little cradle like so. You're rolling the glue out even. Make sure that every square centimeter of the board is covered. You're rolling the glue out even. After you stick the planks together, you don't have an option to add glue. Seeing I got just a little thin, come back and add a few drops of glue from the glue bottle and spread it one last time before I put the planks together. Another reason for making sure you have plenty of glue, and the reason I use Titebond, besides its waterproof characteristics, is many of the exotic woods have a high oil content, sap, resin, and the Titebond 3 does seem to do a better job of adhering to those oily woods. Padauk for sure is one that qualifies as a more oily type wood. You see, I'm not extremely neat with my glue. I am trying to be very particular to make sure that every bit of the surface has some level of a glue film on it. Most people tell me I'm wasting glue. I look at it like that amount of glue is cheap compared to my time that I'm investing. If you're building one cutting board a year, you can take more time. So remember, I laid this out, and I remembered the orientation that the boards go into the plank. Now I want to point out here, when I've pressed these into these boards down on the cawl, you'll notice over here, this board and this one being up. The board wasn't perfectly flat. It had a bit of a curve to it. That's what the cawls are going to do for you. They're going to pull those boards level. Tiny bit of wax paper and put on top under the cawls. My fancy dancy cawls, I can pull down into place, and I tighten them just a little. Not too tight right now. Just get them good and a little snug. That's starting to push the boards down to where they're all in the same plane, level on top and bottom. Next, start just initial Oh, these things stick quick with a little bit of pressure. I line the ends on this end ever so lightly. Start snugging the clamps up. I'm not going to demonstrate it, but if you're not using these parallel clamps, if you're using pipe clamp, bar clamps, quick clamps, you'll definitely want to alternate them top and bottom. The benefit of these big parallel clamps is they do, as their name implies, and they apply parallel forces. It's a very big benefit to the way that I do it. Makes it easier. I realize not everybody is fortunate to have a wall full of those clamps. Now that I've got them snug, I come back and I tighten up these cawls. The bar linkage here, and then the way the clamp is pulling, that's putting equal pressure from this bar to the bar that's underneath. Another trick that I've learned through the years is when you have some boards that are beginning to stick together and you notice they're not aligning, you can run your finger under here. A quick bump from a hammer can help. That's feeling pretty good. So the levels are pretty close. So now I get heavy. The specs on these Bessie clamps say they put 1,500 pounds of pressure. You notice my spacing, I've got 8 boards on 48 inches, so my spacing is somewhere around 6 inches. Can go a little larger than that, but if I wasn't using these parallel clamps or pipe clamps on alternating sides, if you're using other types of clamps, you really need to get some pressure on. Now, in my process, once I have these parallel clamps tight, these boards are not moving anymore. So now, I can release the cawls and get them up out of the way. So I'm gonna pull the wax paper off. I'm gonna get some paper towel and a handy plastic putty knife, and I'm gonna scrape up the excess glue. This is going to give me relatively flat surface so that when this plank is dry and I go to plane this plank, this side that I'm wiping the excess glue off of will go down onto the planer bed. I allow all of my glue ups to dry overnight so that when I go to plane the opposite side, there will be glue run out, but it will be dry. In my planer, it's a helical cutter head with carbide cutters. I've never had an issue. And then I take a paper towel. What I can't scrape up, I smear out, wipe off as much as possible, and make sure that there's no beads protruding, rising up above the surface of the plank. That glue up of that plank is complete. So that's how I allow the plank to sit overnight until I'm ready for the next step. That's glue up one using my fancy cawls. Now I wanted to show the easier method of using some angle iron or wood cawls in the same fashion. So now we're set up for our second plank glue up, and I'm still using my parallel clamp, but I've got rid of those fancy custom made cawls, and I'm using a spacer that's above the level of my clamp, and I have some angle iron with some clamps to use for cawls. That can be replaced with a 2x2 that you can use with a wooden cawl. I would say on wooden cawls that you want to crown the pressure face because the wood is not as strong as metal, and that way you make sure that you're applying pressure to the center of the plank. So once again, you can do a little search on the internet for wooden cawls and maybe you can see some details there. Just like always, I pull out the wax paper. So I cover up my clamp. I get the ends of my clamps even to the end. I just know that's less headache on me. We turn over to the glue table. Now this is the pattern that we're going to use to make an end grain board. And I've checked those patterns earlier to make sure that the joints don't mess up. Just because I did it last time, I'm going to make the same motion in that direction. And I need to rotate all of the boards this way to get the proper side up for gluing. Gluing is the exact same process. We go into the same motion. I've done this hundreds of times. What you may want to do is mark the surface of your pattern before you apply glue so that you can keep track. This is being shown late in the process, but when you were laying out your pattern, if you'd have done that with a piece of chalk, then when you did the glue up and you're placing it here in the clamps, you can make sure that you got them back the way you intended, because once you apply glue, you're in a bit of a hurry. Now, we've got cawls underneath, not clamped up, because these cawls have to be clamped manually. I normally just give me a little bit of motion like that, like so. What I'll show you here is what I've been doing. I did this for a long time until I made those custom fancy cawls. Is you clamp a cawl top and bottom. You notice how much time it takes to do this manually. I have heard the opinion many times that you don't want to tighten it too tight. You'll squeeze all the glue out. I have not done a scientific study. I don't know any more than anybody else, but as I said, I've made over 1,000 boards. I think it's impossible to squeeze the glue out. Making your clamps very tight compensates for your boards not being level, even. Your squaring process might not have been so great, and excessive pressure in your clamp seems to overcome that. But I put everything I got into it, and you can see the glue squeezing out on the glue lines. Just like earlier, as soon as you get those clamps tight, the cawls are no longer required. Those boards are not moving. One of the real big benefits to using the parallel clamp is that you have access to this face of the plank, and you can scrape the excess glue off, prepping it for when you go to plane the plank flat. Scraped off about all I can get. Wipe off any other excess glue that you can get wiped off. This is a large plank that is intended to create an end grain with an alternating reversing pattern. You'll see that the glue on this side I scraped off and I wiped off while the glue was wet. That's the benefit of using these parallel bar clamps. You can get to one side of the glue up when it's wet. You don't have to have a clamp on both sides. So now to remove the clamps. Okay, so this goes to the planer. The side that I've wiped all the glue off when it was wet goes down on the planer bed. I run dried glue through my planer. I have helical carbide tip bits. Many people say that's a horrible thing to do. I've been running them through this planer for 7 or 8 years. I've never rotated the carbide cutters. I don't have any issue. Don't run wet glue through your planer. You're going to suffer. If I did not have helical carbide cutters, I don't think running glue through is a good idea. It would probably be detrimental. So you'll want to pull out a hand scraper or some other device to get the glue off of the surface of your plank before you go to the planer if you don't have that type of helical carbide bit. You don't want glue on your clamps. You can see the glue beads. If you put that surface down on the bed of your planer, you don't know how it's going to go through your planer. That's why you wipe the glue off the one side that you're running through on the bed. I've planed this board and it is basically flat everywhere. And as we all know in woodworking, the skill of your woodworking is how you overcome obstacles. This piece of mahogany and this piece of mahogany, I glued in opposite directions. So when I get a smooth cut on one, I'm getting tear out in the other direction. This is primarily meant for an ingrained board, so that's going to be glue faces, so it's not going to be significant. So before I glue this up, I'll hit that real quick with a DA just to get that roughness from sticking up. Now we've ended up with a 1 5/8 thick plank. Now if you were making an edge grain board. You cut the end off, you cut your segment out, you finish your edges. That would be an edge grain board. Purpose for this plank was to cut in segments, turn up on edge so the grains are sticking up, glue them together again to make an end grain board. So next we're going to go to the table saw and cut the segments. I'm going to show first cutting this board using my custom built table saw sled with some devices I made because I make lots of cutting boards and make lots of segments. I will also then pull out the miter gauge on a different plank and show you how to cut segments using a standard miter gauge with a stop on the table saw. So I've got 46 inches of good segments that are 1 5/8 thick. I'm going to want to cut them about 1 7/8 long. So that's going to work out perfect to my minimum thickness ratio. If you are preparing to cut the segmented section from a plank, this is a very common way that you would do it. You would set up a stop, and I'm going to set this stop up to cut these 1 3/8 inches wide. Lock it in place, but I'm going to move my stop back to this area and just to hold it in place. And this stop can be made and created in any manner you want. But space it so that when the slice is going past the blade, the slice is free to move away from the blade. That's the real trick. This stop can be created by clamping in any way, type, form you got, but there's plenty of freedom for the board to move. You'll want a nice quality miter gauge. Most of them that come with your basic saw probably is not very good. This is a Incra brand and it works quite nicely. It's very accurate. Now the first cut will just be to square up the end. So I'm aligning the saw, the plank with the blade, so it's going to cut a minimum amount of material. I side back, take the plank over to the stop, making sure you don't collide with the blade. Hold very tightly against your miter. There's cutting segmented sections, and you can see that the lengths are extremely accurate. That's how you do it with standard miter gauge. It works great. The only issue is when you get down to the last little bit of this plank, it's going to be hard to cut the last 1 or 2 sections extremely accurate because the width of the plank against the guide is very narrow. That and some safety considerations are why I went with this sled. Sleds by themselves can be used in the same way with a stop. You know, some stops have flip up, so you push the plank against the stop on the sled, push it past the saw. 2 other quite adequate, great ways to cut segmented sections for end grain cutting board. This is my overdone elaborate sled, which works great. It's large for carrying large planks. I've got this stop. On these slots, it's adjustable. I set the gap between the saw blade and the stop in this direction. That's the width of the segment, which ends up being the thickness of the cutting board. The reason it pivots out of the way is so that I can put the board in place and clamp it down and then remove the stop so that there's freedom between the board and the stop and it doesn't bind against the blade. As well, this overhead clamp does a great job of capturing the dust. It seals the top of the board, so all of the dust on the saw blade goes down and is caught by the dust collector. And this is what is so critical on making these cuts But all of these are very much the exact same height. That is a goal in making an in-grain cutting board, because any irregularities in the height of these is that much more sanding or flattening you have to do. One of the things that's required, these are our pattern segment for our end grain. You remember we cut these on the table saw sled, and they're all the exact same length, and they're going to go together something like this. But part of the plan was that we're going to alternate every other segment to give you a more interesting pattern for an end grain cutting board. So we've got to glue those together. Before we glue them together, as accurate and nicely set up as I try to be, the tear out from the saw needs to be cleaned up on the corners just a little bit. Yeah. Okay, now the other thing is, just like always, covering your clamps with wax paper. Enough room between our clamp. The nice thing about this glue up is all the boards are the exact same height. So I am going to pick this board up. I'll start my pattern and my glue up there, and then I will rotate all of these boards. They're all the exact same height, so you get to do this. And on this big surface, I use one of these little silicone brushes. Just don't lose your orientation from here to here. Another thing you can do, many people do, is rub in your glue lines, swiping them back and forth. That height variation, we've talked about it several times. It is a pain to overcome via sanding. You want to avoid variations in that height as much as you can. On a board like this that is this thick is where take your time, because when you start tightening up these boards, and you've got the amount of glue between them that we do to fill any possible voids, to make sure that there's enough glue. When you pressure them, sometimes that will cause the wood to shift. And so as you're tightening along the edges, we design the pattern so that the alignment from one board to the next, they're not aligned. So if they move, it's not a visible indicator that something's wrong. This design is one of the most forgiving for that purpose. Crank them down. They were tight and they loosened up. As the pressure's applied, the glues start running out and the clamps will loosen. So you got to keep cranking it down, checking your alignment. Now remove as much glue as you can. I did notice that the glue run out was somewhat consistent on the joints. That's good. The next step on this face of this board is sanding. Sanding is different than planing. Sand glue will build up in your sandpaper on whatever device you're using to sand. So you want to get as much glue off as possible. The glue that's absorbed into the wood grains, I've never found to be that much of an issue, but glue on your surface will get into your sandpaper and cause you some grief. That will be a very pretty in-grain cutting board and require a lot of sand. Now the problem is there's a lot of glue on the back side of this board that we can't get to wipe off because of the clamps. I have an old cheap Black & Decker plane. I have that scraper that I showed earlier. I scrape the glue off the back side. I'll probably give this about 6 or 7 hours in the clamp, so I'll probably come down right before bed and get that glue off. The glue on the surface with that wax paper up against it will still be somewhat damp, not set hard, and I should be able to get it off without too much effort. If you don't get it off while it still has some moisture in it, you will want to wait until it's totally dry so that you can get it off with the hand plane. A little bit easier. Or Get your random orbital sander and get you some 60 grit and take the glue off. Try not to get too much into your wood with that 60 grit because that makes sanding it to a nice smooth finish more difficult. I'm married to my beautiful wife Patricia, who's a realtor here in Cobb County. Maybe from this, somebody in the guild can tell me a better way to do this. I haven't learned it. Fancy clamp, fancy clamp, fancy clamp, fancy clamp, fancy clamps.